Hello and welcome to NewsClick. You're watching Present, Past and the Future. Recently, the Union Ministry of Culture formed a 7-member committee to locate and conserve the grave of Mughal Prince Dara Shukoh. It is believed to be located inside the Humayun's tomb complex in Delhi. Government ordering archaeological and historical exploration is the norm. It fills important blank spaces of the past. But when a particular facet or a specific historical character's life is probed consistently, it requires examination. Is there a political purpose behind this decision of the government? After all, Dara Shukoh is seen as a good Muslim by this government and the political forces that prop it up. Just a few months ago, the Sah-Karyawah or the Joint General Secretary of Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, Krishna Gopal, lavished praise on Emperor Aurangzeb's brother, who lost a bitter and violent battle for power. Krishna Gopal said, if Dara Shukoh had become the emperor in place of Aurangzeb, the character of Islam in India and the country's story would have been completely different. Sangh Parivar's demonization of Aurangzeb is not new. The government changed the name of Aurangzeb Road some years ago. Actually, the Sangh Parivar's use of Dara Shukoh is representative of their what-if approach to the past. India would have been a better country if Sardar Patel was the first Prime Minister of India instead of Jawaharlal Nehru. Well, this is one of the standard ways of posing this question. But is Dara Shukoh being propped up by the Hindu nationalistic discourse with a specific purpose? Will his resurrection help popularizing their theory that communal discord, partition of India and other identity-related evils are Aurangzeb's legacy? Was Dara Shukoh really a great secularist in contrast to the bigot that Aurangzeb is made out to be? Is the search for Dara Shukoh's grave part of this regime's efforts to create ideal role models in the present as well as in the past? These are very important questions about the past because they impact our present. I am joined by Farhat Hassan, a medieval historian of repute, to discuss these questions. He teaches at the Delhi University.
Thank you.
Farhat, let's begin by a pure historical thing, question. It has been written, and one of the leading archaeologists of the 20th century had said that his grave was one of the tens of graves which are lying unidentified in the Humayun's tomb complex. How does one actually go about establishing which one is this one? It's like, yahi qabr unki.
I don't think there is any way you can discover the grave of Dara Shukoh. So insofar as I think, this is actually an exercise in futility. Because, obviously, these graves were not, are all unmarked. There are no identifying element that defines a grave. And therefore, how would one differentiate the grave of Dara Shukoh from so many other graves in the vicinity of the Humayun's tomb?
So either historically or archaeologically, this is not possible.
That's how I tend to think, yes. I think it's an exercise in futility. Yeah.
You cannot do a DNA testing and then test it with Aurangzeb's grave, go and dig that up and do a DNA testing from the graves that you dig up.
I could understand an interest in Dara Shukoh, but an interest in the living Dara Shukoh would be a far more exciting venture than an interest in the dead Dara Shukoh.
Right.
And if the interest in Dara Shukoh is about knowing him better, it's about understanding his contribution to philosophy and comparative religion. That's a very encouraging thing, and we are all in it. But if the renewed interest in Dara Shukoh is actually a political exercise. Uh, you know, uh, Motivated by the need to use him for right-wing mobilization, then obviously it's something that has no meaning for a historian like me.
This is what is the basic purpose?
Yeah, I think this is exactly what's happening. I mean, they're trying to do with Dara Shukoh what they did with Patel or Bhagat Singh, or are trying to do with Gandhi. Use him as an example of a good Muslim, and then appropriate him to for the construction of right-wing nationalism. And Dara Shukoh is obviously a very bad example to choose for this kind of an activity, for this kind of an endeavor.
You talked about it would have been better if they had looked for a living Dara Shukoh. Now, this which actually brings out, he's quite often presented as a symbol of what we call the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb. Now, from a historian's perspective, going back to the what-if theory of the favorite what-if theory of the Sangh Parivar, would he have been a kinder king? What Krishna Gopal said, that Indian history would have been completely different. Would it have been? Suppose for a moment, let's say that history had not been what it is, but it had been something different.
I mean, behind this question, there is an obvious attempt to posit Aurangzeb and Dara Shukoh against each other, as if they are very different entities. That's one problem with it. The other problem is the need to present Dara Shukoh as an exceptional
exceptional Muslim,
as an exceptional Muslim, as an exceptional prince as well. And this is again wrong, because Dara Shukoh is after all a product of the Mughal court culture, and all that Dara Shukoh was trying to do is actually a continuation of an enduring Mughal courtly tradition. He was translating Upanishads, he was translating Hindu texts into Persian, so was Akbar. He had creative engagements with the yogis, and you have instances of Akbar and Jahangir doing the same.
Same thing.
Jahangir had immense
Akbar is also juxtaposed as a good Muslim in contrast to a bad Muslim.
I'm coming to Aurangzeb in a minute. But there are these enduring traditions that had been laid in place by Akbar, and they continued down to the end of the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb also, despite his personal predilections, failed to change them. Let's not forget that there were more non-Muslim in the bureaucracy, in Aurangzeb's bureaucracy, than was the case in Akbar. There were more Hindus in his army. The idea that somehow Dara Shukoh was more acceptable to the Hindu aristocracy is again misplaced, because the Rajputs en bloc supported Aurangzeb in the War of Succession, not Dara Shukoh. So that these are very broad, generalized impressions that have been created in order to posit Aurangzeb as the villain of history and Dara Shukoh as the hero of history. Now, this kind of a history is deeply problematic, which is centered on creating heroes and villains all the time, instead of looking at deeper processes of social and historical change. And this is what should have been the focus of this exercise.
The discourse, the Hindu nationalistic discourse, says that in contemporary Muslim thinking, in Muslim society, there are two strands of thought. One is the fundamentalist strand, Wahhabi, Jihadi, use any kind of words, and the other is the good strand, which is the secular. Secular is also a bad word, it's also part of Jihadi's narrative. Rashtravadi, I think that is a better way of putting it. So was there fundamentalist strand versus the Rashtravadi Hindu-leaning strand during the medieval era, especially the Mughal period?
No, I don't think that's the case. First of all, because it would be a very deeply problematic formulation to say that you had a vision of the nation in the Mughal period. The nation is a very modern conception, and you don't have an idea of a nation or nationalism or attachment to the nation state in the Mughal period.
It's pure territory.
It's pure territory, and you have notions of local patriotism, but they don't translate as nationalism. So this whole idea of Rashtravadi.
So there was no Sultanawadi sentiment.
No,
it was all for the land, Sultanat ki. The boundary.
You could have attachments to your caste. You could have attachments to your community. You could have attachments to your village or townships. But the idea of a nation, an attachment to a nation state, is something that's a very modern development in history. Now, with reference to the divisions or strands in the world of Indian Islam, yes, you had conservative elements in Indian Islam, but as is the case with all religions. But the important point is to see the kind of influence these strands had in shaping Mughal state policy. Or do they justify this kind of a juxtaposition of Aurangzeb with Dara Shukoh, as is being done by some thinkers today? That's the point. You see, because there are only two issues, two aberrations that are important in the case of Aurangzeb. One is which is always trumpeted, is the evidence of the destruction of temples. But what is easily ignored is the fact that he patronized, protected more temples than he destroyed.
Actually, do we have figures of this, or some specific?
Yeah. Of course.
These are not known. Can you just list a few of them?
So many of them. You have Tarapad Mukherjee and Irfan Habib have discovered the famous Vrindavan documents. These documents are incidentally lodged in the temple archive. They're not a part of the Mughal archive. And you have a large number of documents of cash-free grants, stipends, land grants, revenue-free grants being granted to the temples in Mathura and Vrindavan, not just by Aurangzeb, Jahangir and Shah Jahan, but Aurangzeb as well. That's one thing.
This is what needs to be publicized, but it is not publicized.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
History is being used for present politics.
That's the concern. That's the concern. These interesting facets of Aurangzeb's policy have largely been sidelined in the attempt to demonize Aurangzeb and present him or use him to get back at the Muslim community today. So there's a political project that informs the historiography on Aurangzeb today. There is very interesting evidence of Aurangzeb providing revenue-free grant, Madad-e-Marsh grant, to the Nathpanthis, and which is quite ironical, because the person who demonizes Aurangzeb so much in the Muslim community happens to be a Nathpanthi himself. You have that evidence too. There is evidence of Aurangzeb providing for the maintenance of ghee, supply of ghee, to a temple in Agra. So you have a large number of evidence of state providing active patronage to the temples in all over the Mughal regime. Yes, there are instances of temple destruction too. There is an instance of the destruction of the temple at Kashi, Kashi with them. Now, there's instance of the destruction of Keshav Das temple in Mathura. Now, all these, if you equate evidence of destruction of temples and evidence of patronage to temples together, one thing that is very obvious, that this is not about iconoclasm. This is about politics of the period.
Okay. So it's not about imposition of religious identity.
Not at all. That's what I'm trying to say. Because the destruction of the temple at Kashi, for example, was because there is a zamindari revolt taking place, and this zamindari revolt is supported by the authorities controlling the temple complex.
Right.
There is also an accusation that Jai Singh, who constructed that temple, Vishwanath temple, had facilitated the release of Shivaji
Okay.
So there is this context too that informs the.
So it is not that the Kashi Vishwanath temple was demolished because he wanted to go and build a mosque there
Not at all.
and assert the hegemony of political
Exactly.
Islam, but it is essentially something which arises out of a political process, a pure rivalry for power.
Power, exactly. What he wanted to assert was certainly the power of the state, not the power of the faith.
Not to go and stamp the authority of Islam.
Exactly.
Same thing in Mathura also?
In Mathura, you have a very substantive Jat rebellion taking place, and the Jat community have entangled relations with this Keshavdas temple. So there is a the temples were destroyed in Rajasthan too, in the Mewar and the Marwar regions, and these were because of the Rathore rebellion and the developing Sisodia-Rathore alliance against the Mughal state. So there is an important political context that informs the stray, and I repeat, stray incidents of the destruction of temples that occur in Aurangzeb's reign. Now you have the choice of focusing on 3-4 instances and demonize the whole of the Mughal Empire.
This was the entire thing that was happening.
That was happening, yes.
Since we are talking about temples, I think we must bring in the third point of conflict, that is Ayodhya, which has actually dominated this country for the last 7 decades. Specifically more so since 1984, when the Sangh Parivar launched its agitation for building a Ram temple in Ayodhya. Now, I have studied this particular shrine, its history and its entire politics behind it much more than Mathura and Kashi. What we find is that in this case there was not even, there's no certainty that whether the mosque was actually built by Babur and whether the mosque was built after demolishing. Even the Supreme Court verdict does not say that a temple was destroyed to build a mosque.
Exactly.
Yes, there is some evidence that there was a pre-existing temple-like structure at the same site, but does not mean that it was demolished and a mosque came up in this place.
Exactly.
So I think it's very important for us to understand that Dara Shukoh and Aurangzeb were not fighting because of a different approach towards Islam and Hinduism.
Not at all.
What were they fighting for?
Not at all. I mean, two things need to be
If we try to understand it, you are an expert of the subject. So what was the bone of contention for them?
Yeah.
Purely the Gaddi?
Purely the Gaddi, yes, of course. I mean, the issues had become slightly more complex for Aurangzeb for 2 reasons. One is that he had ascended the throne in the lifetime of his father.
Right.
Now this is
his father had nominated Dara Shukoh.
Dara Shukoh as the heir. Yeah. Now these are two very significant problems that Aurangzeb was faced at the time of his accession, because this was never acceptable that a son could replace the father to the crown. The only way Aurangzeb could do it was to argue that Shah Jahan had abdicated faith. And that
there's also this popular belief that Shah Jahan was jailed by
he was so that this was the first time in Mughal history that a reigning sovereign was dethroned, and in the lifetime of the father you have the son taking charge.
There would have been some reasons for Aurangzeb to do that, or that's the way he was made?
No, he was scared of Dara Shukoh being appointed as the heir apparent if he lets this.
So, he would have also been part of the Mughal process. So, he was also part of the culture that the eldest son becomes the next.
Exactly.
So, why did he revolt?
Who?
Aurangzeb.
Yeah, because he wanted to take power. I mean, it's about Gaddi, it's about power again. And therefore.
So, he was more ambitious.
He was more ambitious. And I think Dara Shukoh was also equally ambitious. I mean, it's not that he had any deficit in, I mean, the tendency to portray Dara Shukoh.
To look at it as a very benign person,
as a benign, saintly person, a peace-loving. That's not true.
Almost looking for a Gandhian in medieval India.
They were both extremely ambitious princes, hankering after power.
So how did Aurangzeb go about building the alliance, especially with the Rajput?
Yeah, that's significant, because the first thing he did was to cultivate alliances with the Rajputs. Now, Rajputs were also divided into different clans. There were Kachwas, there were Sisodias, and Aurangzeb had a huge success in incorporating all of them behind him against Dara Shukoh. The references in Rajput sources to Dara Shukoh are never benign. They see him as arrogant. They see him as full of himself.
And these are Rajput sources.
Yeah, these are the Rajputs. So that
it's not doctored by any Muslim.
No. These are the Rajput Rajasthani sources. So that for the Rajputs at least, Aurangzeb was far more acceptable as a ruler than Dara Shukoh. And this is important because the argument of of an uniform anti-Hindu reaction taking shape in Aurangzeb's reign is not borne by evidence. That's important. Huh?
Right. So when does this belief start really coming up that Dara Shukoh stood in contrast to Aurangzeb, not just because of political power, because he was very brutally killed and beheaded, and his body was scattered all over and buried. No name was given to the grave. Now, when did the story start building up that this was actually because of their different approaches to Islam, because of Dara Shukoh being more embracing as a king, Aurangzeb being the tyrant who was not just a tyrant but he was also a religious zealot? When does the story start coming up?
I think this only happens in the colonial period. You have this strain of historiography
by the colonial historians?
In several writings of the colonial historians, by colonial imperialist historians. And the reason why they did so was to, first of all, present Aurangzeb as the antithesis of what the British colonial state represented.
Okay.
So, whereas Aurangzeb was despotic and arbitrary,
so the colonial state was kind of
legitimating its dominion by portraying Aurangzeb in a particular light.
Right.
Now, within that frame of reference, only because Dara Shukoh didn't become the ruler. Had he become the ruler, the portrayal of Dara would have been very different. There was also this argument that there is this benign philosophical prince who was ruthlessly eliminated from the scene by Aurangzeb. So these kinds of polar opposites begin to emerge in the 19th century, but they were then taken up in a big way by the right-wing historiography.
What you're trying to say is that Dara Shukoh's portrayal as a counterbalancing force to Aurangzeb basically came as a handy ally for the colonial historians.
Exactly.
In their attempt to say that they were the legitimate rescuers of India in contemporary India.
Yes, exactly.
To legitimize their rule, that they were not despotic because they were taking India out from the clutches of something which had been terribly despotic and tyrannical.
Exactly. The other element is to present India as a divisive country, a country in which people essentially and primarily fight over religious symbols and religious rituals, and to present the Mughal state as adding fuel to the fire, adding fuel to the fire.
Islam in India.
Yeah, and therefore the British state then becomes not only a neutral arbiter, but also a state that can protect the interests of the majority non-Muslim population in India.
So what you're trying to say is that can we say that there was actually no religious conflict? That's a phrase which is used in today's context. There was no existence of religious conflict in Mughal India, or specifically in Aurangzeb's period.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are three issues here. One is that, first of all, there can well be, and there is a tendency to present conflicts emerging out or emerging from material domains, over material issues, over issues of caste and community identities as religious conflicts in the colonial and modern historiography. You have this tendency, in much of the imperialist and right-wing historiography. The second thing is a substantive issue, which is that of the nature of religious identity in the pre-colonial period. And first of all, let us be very clear that religious identities in the Mughal period were extremely fluid.
Okay.
And therefore, to envisage a situation
fluid,
where
what does it mean?
People borrowed from each other's religious rituals and symbols in a big way.
Okay.
There could well be a Maulana who would offer prayer in the temple, in the mosque, and then go to a temple and pay respect to a god or a goddess.
Right.
And there are numerous instances.
So people are not divided on religious lines.
Exactly. And they could find resources, a shared space of intercultural resources from each other's religions to define themselves as authentic human beings. So that's one problem that you have is the fact that you tend to see religious identities as stable formations, which is actually something that only happens in the colonial period. One. Secondly, even if you assume that religious identities did exist, how does the presence of a religious identity automatically translate itself into communalism? Right. You can have instances, just give me 5 minutes, I'm not sure if I'm taking more time. Religious identities can be indifferent to each other. Religious identities can be mutually appreciative to each other.
Right.
And religious identities can be hostile and antagonistic to each other. There is absolutely no evidence in the Mughal period of religious identities turning hostile and antagonistic to each other.
Right.
There are two evidence for this. One is the evidence of Dabistan-e-Mazahib, the first work on comparative religion to have been written in the early 18th century.
Right.
And one of the things he makes is startling, which is that people are totally indifferent to each other's belief systems. He says that Muslims don't have a clue of what Hindus believe in, and Hindus don't have a clue with what Muslims believe in.
Right.
And he made a very strong case that religious identities are totally indifferent to each other. Okay. And therefore conflicts based on religion or religious rituals and practice is obviously ruled out. Akbar and Dara Shukoh, and Akbar in particular, when he introduced this concept of Sulaykul, made an effort to change this. And one of the things that he says is that, just 2 more lines, is that Sulaykul is only the first stage. And what does he mean by Sulaykul? Sulaykul is about tolerance of difference. And he says, Abul Fazl,
understanding difference also, maybe?
Yeah, and he goes further. He says we need to replace Sulaykul with Muhabbatekul, appreciation of difference. So that this is where Dara Shukoh becomes significant. It is a continuing legacy that Dara Shukoh takes forward. You cannot vilify the Mughal Empire and go on praising Dara Shukoh, which doesn't make sense at all.
Well, Farad, it's been really fascinating talking to you, and
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Have been cleared up, in the course of this discussion. Thank you very much.
No.
In today's India, the present often shapes the past. History and historical figures are routinely being oversimplified. Linear narratives are more useful than a multi-layered story. Everything is being seen in black and white terms. The grey area has disappeared. I hope this discussion has triggered the grey matter here to examine nuances of Indian medieval history. Thank you very much.